Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was a great general who took over France soon after the French Revolution. Using his genius military tactics, he, over the course of his career, made France one of the most successful countries in Europe. During 1774, France was one of the wealthiest areas in Europe, although only the high class had access to these riches and squandered them often. Most of the citizens of France didn't have access to these and often struggled to make a living. Although no one liked the situation they were in, very few people could have thought of a way of life without a king, and even less could think of revolting. When France was starting to gain stacking debts, the king was going to place many reforms on his citizens, but, fortunately, resistance from his assembly of notables and his own courts convinced him otherwise. He was recommended in using a system called the Estates General, which had the ability to give consent to royal decrees. Although the citizens were happy with the return of this system, they were not happy with how the elections of representatives were chosen because it consisted of three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commons. Although on the surface this seems like a fair system, the nobility was mainly dominant because the clergy mainly consisted of nobles. When the estates met in 1789, the difference between social powers became apparent, and due to this a revolutionary group called the National Assembly rose up and declared that they had right to their government. In 1791, King Louis was worn down by the Assembly and made a new constitution that would limit his own powers. But the commoners were already outraged with the luxury that the monarchy lived, while the commoners could barely afford their highly taxed bread. Since 1789, the king had been urged and warned to flee his country to keep his so-called absolute power, but he resisted this for 2 years until he had to limit his power, where he finally decided to flee the country with his family, but he ended up caught and returned to the capital. Although the revolution was going strong, there was a threat of a counter-revolution. But the revolution managed to cast anger upon them onto the monarchy and convince them that the revolution was doing all it could for the people of France. After this, the monarchy lost all respect from its people. Within a short time of that, Louis was tried and prosecuted because of documents found in a locked chest that proved him against the revolution, and within 24 hours he was sentenced to death. All of this led up to Napoleon taking the throne of France in 10 years. Napoleon was born on August 15th, 1769 in Ajaccio, France, to a prominent family with kind parents Carlo Maria and Lezina Ramlino Bonaparte. He was born into a family of soldiers. Napoleon's parents were very considerate to him and his siblings, and they were very generous to them. Like, for example, they gave them a room to do anything he wanted, like draw on the walls or just an area to play. Although Napoleon loved his brother very much, he could be hot-headed at times and always beat him, even though he was younger and smaller. Napoleon also grew up in a very religious home because his mother was a devout Christian, but later in life, Napoleon lost all interest in religion except for its political value. This was likely due being so overly forced into his religion. Napoleon was also known for his big ego as a child, and he was incredibly honest and would report things he wasn't supposed to do to his mother without fail. He was always trying to keep routines to stay orderly, and very generous to others, and he kept these qualities throughout his life. He started his schooling at the age of 5 and did very well for himself in it, and was especially fond of arithmetic, which was one of the reasons he became an artillery officer in the military. When it was learned that Napoleon excelled at arithmetic, he went off to train to become an artillery officer in the military. He was sent off to get trained at a military school in Brienne in the Champagne region of France. As well as military training, they also received basic schooling while there too. He had to spend 5 years there, isolated from his family, as per regulations of the school. The school was austere and very quick to give disciplinary action. It also had a rough climate with very hard winters that would heavily impact the small, unheated rooms. Napoleon was bullied in the school by people of higher social standing, and he closed off into his studies. After passing his artillery exam, he eventually left Brienne in 1784 to go to a better military school in Paris, and would stay there until 1790, when it closed, and moved on to other things. He also became interested in politics by this time and thought very highly of philosopher and political theorist Jean-Jacques about his views on liberty, rights, and in 1796, after many victories, Napoleon became a general of France, and he had many successful battles as a general, such as when Napoleon went to Milan, Italy, and he convinced the people there that he was there to free them from their enslavers. But he actually plundered and looted Italy, and as soon as the people of Italy found out, they turned against him, but he had already conquered most of Italy and taken their most valuable possessions. Now that Napoleon had a taste of power, he couldn't give it up and wanted more. Napoleon wanted more victories to increase his reputation, so he went to Egypt to try to conquer it, but he was defeated. Although he was defeated, he used propaganda and his control over the media to make it seem as if it was a military success. By 1780, he was one of the most powerful men in France. Napoleon had completely reorganized France by building infrastructure and setting up banks to build the economy. By 1790, Napoleon had successfully made a new government, rewritten the constitution, and had established himself as head of state. Napoleon had become a savior of France. Napoleon even set up a national religion for Catholicism, although, as stated before, he had no personal use of the religion, but used it for its political influence. Even with all this power, Napoleon still wanted more, so in 1803, Napoleon decided to become the Emperor of France. Only after a little more than 10 years after their old king was executed, France had named a new king to the throne. Napoleon even sent for a pope to be brought to France to sanctify his crowning as emperor, to make it seem like God approved him as king. Even though he was now king, Napoleon was still the general of the military, and was able to conquer more land for France. Although France was doing well for itself under the leadership of Napoleon, the citizens were beginning to feel discomforted by his strict rule. By 1808, conquered territories began to revolt against him when he went off to fight more battles, and began to aid France's enemies, which made his battles much more difficult. Eventually, Napoleon was forced to leave his throne when he lost to Allied forces in Europe, and they took control over France and exiled Napoleon to an island called Elba. Napoleon stayed on Elba for 300 days until he escaped, and met up with a loyalist group and marched to take back France. Although Napoleon was a military expert, he had a drastically reduced force, and was defeated at Waterloo, and was once again exiled to another island called St. Helena, where he would spend the rest of his days. Although there is much controversy into how Napoleon died, it is said to be most likely that he died of stomach cancer. In death, Napoleon left a legacy that would live on even today. He left a legacy of being a great military tactician and king. let us not forget that he built France up to one of the most successful countries in Europe at the time. A survey on the most important figures in history showed Napoleon as being second to only Jesus in importance in history. Napoleon had great values in equality and freedom, and used these thoughts in his reforms that he put into effect in France. Many other countries saw these ideals and used them to help start revolutions and put them in their constitutions. If not for Napoleon's ideals, America could have not ended up revolting against their king, and the America we know today could be different. Napoleon's military tactics are also still in use today around the world and have changed warfare forever.